In Warhammer 3 and pretty much any Total War, the stats in battle are something you see all the time, but how many of them do you really understand? Sure, there are the obvious ones, but a lot of them have a lot more depth than you might think. So I thought I'd make this video to explain everything on the battle cards so that you can understand everything about the units you're taking into battle. First up, we have the unit type. Just below the name of the unit, you can see the type of unit they are with a name and an icon. This can tell you a lot about the unit and what sorts of things they'll be good at. For example, spear infantry are generally good line holders with high defense and charge defense versus large, whereas shock cavalry will be good at charging in and out of units to maximize their damage. The icon also tells you a lot, as two units can be the same type but have a different icon. Crossbowmen and handgunners are both missile infantry, but one has a bow icon and the other has a gun. This tells you their firing arcs, as bow units can fire over units' heads and gun units need a straight line of sight. There are a bunch of these, so if you want me to explain them all, let me know. HP is next up, and this one is quite an easy one. Health points, or HP, is the amount of health that a unit has. When this number reaches 0, the unit will be wiped out. It's decreased by taking damage from any source, whether that's melee combat, ranged, or magic, and it can be increased via certain spells, items, and abilities, and each unit has a cap on how much health they can regenerate per battle to keep things balanced. All you need to know about this one is the higher it is on your own units, the better, and the lower it is on the enemies, also the better. Next, entity and unit size. This one is pretty simple. The number here tells you how many men or entities are in a unit, since let's be honest, more often than not, it's not men or anything even close to it. The icon also tells you if that unit is classed as large or small, and this all boils down to if they will be affected by anti-large damage and charge defense or not. Finally, when you hover over this, you can see the massive entities, and this is given in some pretty vague units, like what does 100 Acne Anvils mean? Is the Wily Coyote going to start dropping steam tanks onto Road Run or something? Anyhow, all you need to know is the mass of your unit and the mass of what they're attacking, and it's only really important if you're trying to make use of charging units. If your unit has a higher mass than their target, they're going to have an easier time charging into them and treading over them, whereas charging units with low mass will be easier to slow down and stop during a charge. But as I said, this only really matters for charging units like caverns and monsters, but it's worth looking into for all your units, as a higher mass infantry line will hold back enemies even if they aren't winning the combat. Now come to armor. Armor is essentially the last line of defense between enemy attacks and your unit's HP pool. All damage, no matter if it's from a range or melee, will have to pass through armor, and any non-armor piercing damage will be reduced by a random amount between the armor value and half of the armor value. For example, if a unit has 100 armor, every bit of non-armor piercing damage will be reduced by a random number between 50 and 100%. This makes the average damage reduction 75% of your unit's armor stat. Of course, armor piercing damage ignores most armor, making it great versus heavily armored targets, and we'll cover damage types a little later on once we get to the weapon strength. The other thing you'll see on the armor stat is any shields that your units have, which is of course used to block missile fire. From the colour of the shield, you can tell what percentage of missiles will be blocked. Bronze is 35% and silver is 55%. Missile block ignores damage types and is basically a flat reduction in the amount of missiles that will hit a target. So if 100 missiles are fired in a target, a bronze shield will only be hit by 65 of them, no matter the damage. This does only work versus small arms, which means anything that's been fired from a handheld weapon, and it also can only block from the front, so being shot in the ass is still very dangerous. Leadership is next, and it is one of the most important stats, as it is the only other stat that can cause a unit to be defeated in battle. It's affected by many things in battle, such as proximity to certain units, spells, abilities, how combat is going, and more. You can always hover over the stat to see what's affecting it at the time, which can be useful to work out why a unit is losing confidence. If a unit drops to a very low level of leadership, they can start to waver and eventually break, which means one of two things. For most mortal units, this means they will run from battle and ignore any commands. They will either get far enough from the fight that they will get some leadership back and can return to battle, or make it to the edge of the map and retreat from battle entirely. If their leadership drops even further, they will eventually shatter, in which case they can never return to combat and will run until they leave the map no matter what. For undead and demonic units, losing leadership means they will start to fall to pieces and take damage per second until leadership is restored. This is made worse once they shatter, causing them to basically evaporate from battles in seconds. Any unit with over 100 leadership is classed as unbreakable and will never lose leadership, run, or disintegrate, and will fight to the last point of HP, no matter how hopeless it might be. Now we have speed. This one is extremely simple, as it's literally how fast units move. Infantry are slower than cav most of the time, and flyers are always the fastest units, of course, while in the air. Different factions have different average speeds for their roster, but all you really need to know is how fast your units are moving and the speed of anything they might end up chasing or being chased by. Whichever is faster will be able to catch or outrun the other, should it be needed, so it's worth remembering. Now we come to melee attack, and this is essentially the unit's chance to land a successful hit, but there's a little extra maths behind it. Chance to hit is calculated by 35% plus melee attack minus the target's melee defense, with a minimum value of 8% and a maximum value of 90%. So if two units of spearmen are in melee combat, they have 20 attack and 34 defense each. This means each time an entity goes for a swing, they have a 21% chance to hit. This seems low, but bear in mind how many entities are attacking at once, and you can see why combat doesn't last for a very long time. Melee attack is also when you can find any imbuements to the unit's attack. These can be things like magical damage, which allow attacks to ignore resistance, flaming, which reduces healing and is stronger versus units vulnerable to fire, or it can be one of many other stats effects such as poison. These are inflicted on targets whenever a successful attack is landed and can affect them in a variety of different ways. Just hover over any you see and they'll be pretty self-explanatory most of the time. Mueller Defense, we've basically just covered a melee attack. It's just the chance the unit has to defend against an attack and take no damage from it. Both this and attack can be affected by abilities and spells and can also be increased via experience. Weapon strength is how much damage the unit will do if they land a successful attack in melee, but it does get reduced by armor and resistances. Weapon strength is split into at least two parts: base weapon damage and armor piercing weapon damage. Armor piercing, of course, ignores most armor and will go straight to the HP pool as long as no resistance gets in the way. Base damage has to be reduced by armor before it can go to the HP bar, as well as making its way through any resistances, so it tends to fall off a lot against high tier units. Finally, there's sometimes a bit of bonus damage, either versus large or infantry, and this is only applied when you're going against those types of units. Bonus damage is split between armor piercing and base using the original ratio. So if a unit has 10 armor piercing and 20 base, then 9 bonus damage will be 3 armor piercing and 6 base. Bonus versus a unit type also increases melee attack against that unit type, but it's not really shown in the attack stats, so it can be a little bit hard to see. Charge bonus is very similar to the bonus damage we just covered, but it only occurs when a unit is in their charging phase, which is just as they're about to clash in combat when they raise their weapons and get a little speed boost. The charge bonus gets added to their melee attack for a duration of the charge, as well as the weapon strength. The weapon strength bonus is again split between armor piercing and base in the same way as the bonus versus large and infantry we just covered. Units like monsters and shock cavalry have a much higher charge bonus than other units, and you want to use them differently to maximize their damage and keep them alive. Without charge bonus, a lot of these units have pretty poor stats, so pulling them in and out of combat to continually charge is the way to go. Also, be aware of units with charged defense, as charging them will not proc the extra damage and can be very dangerous. Ammunition is obviously only on units with a ranged weapon, and is how many volleys that unit can fire in a battle. And a volley is basically a missile from each entity in the unit. Once ammo is all gone, the unit will be forced to attack in melee if it cannot be replenished. The ammo stat will also tell you if missiles have any imbuements similar to melee attacks. Melee and ranged share a lot of these same stats effects, as well as having a couple that are unique, so absolutely have a read to find out each unit, as it can be really important and really powerful. Range is another simple one, since it's just how far a unit can shoot from. Missile infantry generally have a shorter range, with very few of them getting close to 200, whereas artillery can get it over 400. Units are more accurate at shorter ranges, however, so just because your unit can fire from the entire map away doesn't mean they always should, especially if you have limited ammo. Missile strength is very similar to weapon strength, but has a few more factors that make it a little more complicated. The overall weapon strength is calculated by the base damage plus armor piercing damage divided by 1/10 of the reload speed to show the damage it can do over 10 seconds. For units that have explosive ammo, such as artillery, they also gain base and armor piercing explosion damage, but all you do is add those to the regular missile strength and they'll do the same division. Of course, this is assuming every single missile hits, and even when they do, the damage has to pass through armor and any resistances before hitting HP bars. Explosive damage also falls off the further units are from the center of the explosion, so it is more effective versus clumps of enemies rather than single targets. Now come to abilities. These are any active abilities that a unit has, such as spells, item abilities, or just plain old regular character abilities. These can be activated in battle by clicking their icons around the Lord portraits, and can offer a variety of effects you can learn just by having a read. Timing can be everything when using these, so make sure to read the effects. Timing can be everything when using these, so make sure the effects are going to be made full use of when you turn them on. Passive abilities are very similar to regular abilities, but they cannot be manually activated. Instead, they are either always active or automatically turn on once something specific happens. Again, you can hover over each of these to find out what they do and whether they have activation conditions. One important passive which every single entity has is wounds. This basically just means that once they drop below 25% HP, they lose damage and speed to reflect their beat up state, making them a little easier to finish off. Keep an eye on your own units as well as enemies to see which units are about to head out. And finally, resistances are the last piece of the damage puzzle. Resistance comes just after melee defense, so if a blow lands, it has to get through resistance before it can go to armor and finally HP. There are a few kinds of resistance, such as physical, missile, and spell, and each of these are pretty self-explanatory. Ward save is the best kind of resistance, however, as it reduces all incoming forms of damage and cannot be penetrated by anything, so will always reduce incoming damage by that amount. Physical resistance is quite similar to this, as it does protect against most forms of damage, but it can be penetrated by magical and fire, so it isn't quite as powerful. And that is just about everything you need to know about the battle stats in Total War Warhammer 3. Let me know if you have any more questions in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer them. If you enjoyed this video or found it useful, then consider leaving a like and maybe subscribing if you haven't already. Trying to hit 50k by the end of the year, so I sure would appreciate the assist. If you're feeling especially big penis and want to support the channel directly, then consider becoming a member on YouTube or a patron on the Patreon. Doing so gets you early insights into future content, increased voting power, and discounts on merch, as well as shoutouts at the end of videos, just like Henry Tucker for his support at the officers tier. Thank you to all supporters. One last thank you for watching, and for now, I've been COLONELDAMNEDERS, and I will see you next turn.